What you're about to hear is one of the most complex and tragic cases in Australian criminal history, not because of a lengthy rap sheet filled with violence, not because of a career criminal with nothing to lose, but because of something that happens more often than we want to admit. A man with virtually no history of violence, who over the course of 35 years experienced what he genuinely believed was systematic persecution. And on August 26, 2025, that belief, whether justified or not, led to the deaths of 2 police officers. I'm diving deep into some court documents that span more than 3 decades. Documents that paint a complicated portrait of Dezi Freeman, the 56-year-old man, now the subject of Australia's biggest manhunt, with a record-breaking $1 million bounty on his head. Today we're examining the Porepunkah shooting. Stay with me, because what these documents reveal is far more nuanced than the headlines suggest. Let's go back to where it all began. September 1990, Sydney, Australia. A young man named Desmond Philby, just 21 years old, has his first encounter with the legal system. And here's what's important to understand about this. It wasn't violent, it wasn't dramatic, it was mundane. Completely, utterly mundane. Court fines, that's it. A few $100s worth of penalties in the early 1990s, the kind of thing thousands of people deal with every year. Traffic violations, minor infractions, the bureaucratic headaches of everyday life. But here's where Desmond Philby, who would later become Dezi Freeman, made a choice that would set a pattern. He didn't pay them. Now I want you to understand something important here. When you don't pay court fines in Australia, the system doesn't just forget about you. It escalates. Arrest warrants get issued. Those warrants? They authorized up to 2 days in jail for each unpaid fine. This wasn't the legal system being vindictive. This was standard procedure. But in Freeman's mind, as we'll see, this would become something else entirely. His first actual traffic conviction came in October 1991. The location is significant. Violet Town. That's up in Victoria's northeast, the same region where 34 years later, Freeman would find himself in that fatal confrontation. The charge, speeding. The fine, $150. And once again, Freeman didn't pay it. By 1993, the authorities had had enough. They converted his unpaid fine into 8 hours of community work. Freeman completed it. And then something interesting happened. He vanished from the system. Not physically, you understand, but legally. Dezi Freeman became invisible. From 1993 to 2018, 25 years, there is not a single court appearance, not one traffic ticket, not one fine, not one legal entanglement of any kind. For a man who couldn't seem to navigate the system in the early 90s, this is remarkable. So where was he? What was he doing during those 25 years? The court documents don't tell us, but what they do tell us is this. Freeman learned how to exist under the radar, and during those years, something else was happening, something that, looking back, we can recognize as the development of a very different relationship with authority and the legal system. Because when Freeman reappeared in 2018, he had changed. When Dezi Freeman walked back into a courtroom in 2018, he had a new name. Well, sort of. He was now going by Dezi Bird Freeman. The bird was added, though court documents don't explain why. Names can be deeply personal, and this change clearly meant something to him. Freeman appeared in Myrtleford Magistrates Court, and here's what's interesting. He won. He was challenging a 2013 traffic camera fine, something from 5 years earlier, and the magistrate sided with him. The fine was thrown out. Think about what this means. Freeman had learned something during those 25 years. He'd learned how to navigate the system, how to research the law, how to argue his case effectively, and this victory reinforced something important for him. It showed him he could succeed when he stood up for himself. In 2021, we see the first signs of conflict in his community. Freeman was charged with breaching a personal safety intervention order related to a dispute with a neighbor, a woman named Loretta Quinn. The charge was eventually withdrawn, which means we don't have all the details. But what we do know is this. Freeman was starting to have tensions with people around him. For someone who may have been neurodivergent, possibly dealing with autism spectrum traits, these kinds of interpersonal conflicts can be particularly stressful and confusing. And then came 2022. This is where everything starts to intensify. The charges themselves seem minor. In 2020, Freeman had been caught using his phone while driving on the Great Alpine Road. He'd also refused to provide police with a saliva sample. For many people, these would be frustrating but manageable. You'd pay the fine, maybe feel angry about it, and move on. But for Freeman, this wasn't just about the charges. For someone potentially on the autism spectrum, who may process authority, rules, and justice in very rigid black and white terms, these interactions likely felt fundamentally wrong, unjust, worth fighting. He decided to take these charges all the way to the Supreme Court. This wasn't about the mobile phone anymore. This had become about principle, about what he saw as right and wrong. The court documents he filed during this period, they're remarkable. And by remarkable, I mean deeply disturbing, because what they reveal is a man who had created an elaborate narrative of persecution, a narrative that bore almost no resemblance to reality. Let me read you some of what Freeman wrote in his court submissions. These are his own words, and they're critical to understanding his experience. Freeman described his family situation in stark terms. His wife and 3 children, including a 1-year-old baby, were homeless. They were living in a van and a gazebo. Their only income was Centrelink payments. Can you imagine? A family with a baby, living in a vehicle and a temporary outdoor structure, trying to survive on government assistance. That's genuinely heartbreaking. No one should have to live like that, especially not a child. For Freeman, watching his children suffer while feeling powerless to help them would have been devastating. For someone potentially dealing with PTSD, perhaps from previous trauma we don't know about, this kind of ongoing stress and helplessness can be absolutely crushing. But Freeman didn't just describe his circumstances. He explained what he believed was causing them. He talked about 7 years of harassment and persecution by malicious police. 7 years. In his mind, this wasn't random. This wasn't just bad luck. This was targeted. Now let's look at what the court records actually show during those 7 years. Freeman faced one charge that was withdrawn. He successfully fought a speeding fine. By objective measures, this doesn't look like systematic persecution. But here's what's important to understand. For someone with trauma, particularly PTSD, the brain doesn't always process events rationally. Each police interaction, even a routine one, can trigger a fight-or-flight response. Each fine or court date can feel like an attack. The stress compounds. The pattern recognition that helped humans survive for millennia starts seeing threats everywhere. And for someone potentially on the autism spectrum, who might already struggle with authority figures and rigid rule systems that seem arbitrary or unfair, these experiences could genuinely feel like persecution. The neurological processing is different. The emotional regulation is different. What looks like overreaction from the outside can feel like survival from the inside. Freeman wrote something in his court papers that reveals his mental state. He said, "Given the dire situation that we are in, it only takes a straw to break the camel's back. The loss of license is more like a tree trunk than a straw." He wasn't just talking about losing his right to drive. For someone in rural Australia, for a father trying to provide for his family, this was existential. This was about his ability to be a provider, a protector. He called it a form of child abuse by the state. He felt the stress was destroying his family psychologically and emotionally. Now, I want to be clear about something. Losing your driver's license when you live in rural Australia is genuinely difficult. Public transportation is often non-existent. Jobs can be far away. Getting groceries, medical appointments, getting children to school, all of this becomes exponentially harder without a vehicle. Freeman's frustration wasn't baseless, and yes, Freeman had lost his license because he'd violated traffic laws, but from his perspective, especially if he was dealing with undiagnosed or unsupported autism and PTSD, the way the system works might have seemed fundamentally unjust. The rigidity, the lack of consideration for individual circumstances, the compounding penalties that turn minor infractions into major life disruptions. Freeman's experiences kept accumulating. From his perspective, each one was connected to the last, building a pattern that felt intentional. He lost his driving license. That led to losing his firearms licenses. For someone living in rural Australia, firearms aren't just weapons, they're tools. They're for pest control, for protecting livestock, for putting food on the table. And gun clubs are social institutions, places where communities form. Losing these wasn't just bureaucratic. It was losing connection, purpose, and practical means of survival. He documented what he believed were 4 instances of police trespassing on his property. We don't have the police perspective on these incidents, but what matters is how Freeman experienced them. For someone potentially dealing with PTSD, having authority figures on your property without feeling safe or in control can be deeply traumatizing. His wife's van was impounded. To get it back, Freeman had to pay over $2,300. For a family living on Centrelink payments, surviving in a gazebo, that's catastrophic. That's months of food. That's the difference between barely managing and complete collapse. Whether it was standard procedure or not, the impact on his family was real and severe. 4 years of court battles. 4 years of stress, uncertainty, paperwork, hearings. 4 years of feeling like he was fighting just to exist. For someone who might process stress differently, who might not have the neurological tools to regulate anxiety the way neurotypical people do, this would be overwhelming. Near the end of one court submission, Freeman wrote something that should have been recognized as a cry for help. He said, "I hope I didn't get too off track or be abrasive, but I'm just doing the best that I can under extreme duress with what sanity I have left." With what sanity I have left. This wasn't a threat. This was someone saying, "I'm breaking. I'm at my limit. I don't know how much longer I can hold on." Freeman's Supreme Court appeal failed, but he kept driving, using his temporary permission. In December 2023, he got another speeding ticket, 71 in a 60 zone, $450 fine plus $90 in costs. The magistrate who handled that case was Peter Dunn, the same magistrate Freeman had previously attempted to place under citizen's arrest. Freeman genuinely believed the system was corrupt, that magistrates and police were acting unlawfully. From his perspective, a citizen's arrest wasn't vigilantism. It was using the law against those who were violating it. August 26, 2025. A Tuesday morning in Porepunkah, Victoria, a small community in the alpine region of northeastern Australia, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the landscape is beautiful and rugged and isolated. At approximately 10:30 a.m., 2 police officers arrived at Freeman's property to execute a search warrant. This was a routine procedure in their eyes. The kind of thing police officers do regularly across Australia. Detective leading Senior Constable Neil Thompson was 59 years old. He was experienced, had decades on the job. Senior Constable Vadim DeWart was 35, earlier in his career, but no less professional. They arrived at Freeman's property. And then something went catastrophically wrong. We don't have all the details of what happened. This is still being investigated, but what we do know is this. Both officers were shot. Both officers died. Detective Thompson and Senior Constable Dewart didn't make it home that day, and Dezi Freeman, the man with 35 years of court documents showing not a single conviction for violence or firearms offences, became the target of Australia's biggest manhunt. He fled into the rugged alpine country of northeastern Victoria, the same region where he'd lived, where he knew the terrain intimately, where someone familiar with the land could potentially evade search parties for extended periods. Victoria Police launched an unprecedented manhunt. Helicopters, tracking dogs, dozens of officers combing through dense forest and steep terrain. The community was put on alert. Schools went into lockdown. Residents were told to stay indoors. The government announced a reward, $1 million, the largest in Victoria Police history. As of now, Dezi Freeman remains at large. In the aftermath of this tragedy, we need to ask some difficult questions, not just about Freeman, but about the systems that failed everyone involved. Could this have been prevented? Freeman had 35 years of interactions with the legal system. He'd documented his deteriorating mental state in court filings. He'd written about being under extreme duress and losing his sanity. He'd attempted to perform a citizen's arrest on a magistrate. He'd refused to comply with police on multiple occasions. Yet from a risk assessment perspective, he appeared low risk, no violence, no firearms convictions, no recorded threats. Just a man who didn't pay his fines and fought the system through legal channels. But here's what we need to understand. People don't usually wake up one day and commit violence like this. There's almost always a build-up, a progression. And in Freeman's case, all the signs were there, documented in his own words. The problem is, no one was looking at those documents through a mental health lens. Freeman's writings showed classic signs of someone in crisis. The persecution narrative, yes, but also the desperation, the sense of being trapped with no way out, the feeling that his family was being destroyed and he was powerless to stop it. For someone potentially dealing with PTSD and autism, these feelings would be amplified, harder to process, harder to escape from. Some people ask whether Freeman should have been flagged for mental health intervention, and maybe that's true. His court documents certainly showed someone who was struggling deeply, but here's the reality. Our systems aren't set up to catch this. Magistrates aren't mental health professionals. Court clerks aren't trained to identify crisis indicators. And even if someone had noticed, what then? You can't force someone into treatment just because they're angry at the police or feel persecuted. The mental health system is overwhelmed. Wait times for services can be months. In rural areas like where Freeman lived, services are even more limited. And for someone who might be neurodivergent, who might have PTSD, who's living in poverty with a young family, accessing help is even harder. Others ask whether the police should have approached differently. Should they have brought more backup? Should they have assessed Freeman as higher risk? But thousands of search warrants get executed every year in Australia. The vast majority are routine. You can't treat every interaction as potentially lethal. And Freeman had no history of violence, nothing that would suggest this outcome was possible. The truth is, there were warning signs, but warning signs are only useful if there's a system to act on them. And in this case, there wasn't. I want to acknowledge Detective Leading Senior Constable Neil Thompson and Senior Constable Vadim Dewart. Because in cases like this, it's important to remember that these weren't just statistics or headlines. Neil Thompson was 59, with decades in law enforcement. He'd helped countless people throughout his career. Vadim Dewart was 35, in the middle of his career and his life. Their colleagues are grieving. Their families have suffered an unimaginable loss. This tragedy has affected entire communities, from Porepunkah to Melbourne. So what do we take from this case? First, that the intersection of poverty, mental health struggles, neurodivergence and trauma can create situations that our systems aren't equipped to handle. Freeman wasn't a career criminal. He wasn't someone with a history of violence. He was someone who was struggling, who felt cornered, who couldn't access the support he needed. That doesn't justify what happened, but it does help us understand it. Second, we need better integration between our legal system and mental health services. When someone is writing in court documents about losing their sanity, about being under extreme duress, about feeling like they're at breaking point, someone needs to notice. Not to punish, but to help. For people potentially dealing with autism and PTSD, navigating bureaucratic systems can be overwhelming. The rigid rules, the authority interactions, the stress of ongoing legal issues, all of this hits differently when your brain processes things differently. We need systems that can recognize this and intervene before crisis point. Third, we need to talk about how we handle people who feel persecuted by authority. Even when their perception doesn't match reality, their pain is real. Their struggle is real. Dismissing someone's experience as just paranoia or delusion doesn't help. It often makes things worse. Fourth, rural poverty and social isolation are real issues. Freeman's family was living in a van and a gazebo. They had no support network that we know of. They were trying to survive on minimal government assistance in an area with limited services. These conditions create desperation. Fifth, we need to acknowledge that sometimes tragedies happen despite everyone doing what they thought was right. The officers were following procedure, the magistrates were applying the law, Freeman was fighting for what he believed was justice, and somehow it all led to this. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? What city? What country? Drop a comment below and let me know. I'm really curious to see how far this story has reached and where our community is watching from. It helps me understand who's following these cases. As I record this, Dezi Freeman's whereabouts remain unknown. The $1 million reward remains unclaimed. If anyone has information, Victoria Police is asking you to come forward. But beyond the manhunt, this case raises questions we can't ignore. About how we identify people in crisis. About how we support neurodivergent individuals who struggle with authority. About how we handle poverty and homelessness in rural areas. About how trauma and mental health intersect with our legal system. Detective leading Senior Constable Neil Thompson and Senior Constable Vadim Dewitt are gone. Their families are grieving. The Porepunkah community has been forever changed. And Dezi Freeman, a man who spent years documenting his struggle, his fear, his sense of persecution, is now living that persecution as reality. Wanted, hunted, exactly what he believed he was all along. This isn't a simple story of good versus evil. It's a tragedy born from systemic failures, untreated mental health issues, poverty, and a collision between someone who felt he had no choice and a system that didn't know how to help him before it was too late. Thank you for watching. If you know anything about this case, please contact authorities.